To truly understand the company that is BHP Billiton, it's essential to understand how it all started. The ingenuity, the risks, the highs and the lows, the significant events in the company's history and the people behind them. People who shaped the course for BHP and for Billiton. The year was 1883. Charles Rasp was out maintaining fences at the Mount Gips sheep station in western New South Wales when his keen observational skills led him to discover what he at first thought was a mountain of tin on a rocky outcrop known as the Broken Hill. While previous prospectors had dismissed the site as a worthless mound of rock, Charles Rasp saw the potential of what lay beyond the surface. Excited by his discovery, he rushed back to the station and shared the news with his co-workers and the station manager, George McCulloch. A syndicate of 7 was formed, and the team wasted no time in beginning to mine the rich silver and lead.
They started to sink shafts and explore to see whether the silver lead went down or whether it was just shallow. In 1885, they were confident and they decided that they would float a company and raise money. And they sold 500 shares in Sydney, 500 in Melbourne, 500 in Adelaide, and 500 in Little Silverton. Melbourne wasn't quite sure whether this mine was going to be any good, and it was a bit slow to buy the 500 shares. And so this company was formed and it set to work. By 1890, it was one of the major mining companies in the world, paying £1 million in dividends in a year, which was a huge sum, and employing a very large workforce with a deepening mine and an open cut at Broken Hill, silver lead smelters at Broken Hill, a large population then by 10 or 15,000 living on the plains around the Broken Hill.
Of course, BHP is only one half of this story. Equally important is the story of Billiton, whose beginnings were perhaps a little more deliberate. In 1851, 2 Dutchmen with grand names, Vincent Guldenmeester, Baron van Tulvan Saruskirken, and John Francis Loudon, together with their party, discovered a rich supply of tin at Billiton Island, or Billiton, in western Indonesia. The two recognised the potential of tin, and Billiton was born.
At that time there was a newly developed tin zone stretching all the way from Thailand through the Malay Peninsula down to the end of the Indonesian archipelago, and right at the southern end was this island Billiton, and it turned out to be very rich in tin. And the Dutchmen realised it, and they got to work eventually. They formed a company, floated in The Hague in Holland in 1860, and they began to mine it. They were mostly Chinese miners. It was one of the big Chinese settlements outside China at the time.
By any measure, Billiton and the Broken Hill Proprietary Company Limited were off to impressive starts, carving out the foundation, the very character of what was to become BHP Billiton.
All this magnificent pageant of mining achievement, together with the romance of courage, skill and determination on the part of pioneers, scientists and companies, is crystallised in one short name, Broken Hill.
While the directors of the Broken Hill Proprietary Company Limited were quickly developing their business acumen, they soon acknowledged the specialist expertise required to expand the fledgling company. These were, after all, sheep farmers, and mining was a whole new world. The directors started a practice that was highly unusual at the time. They searched far and wide to find the best people to run the company, to drive innovation and establish best practice.
They made one of the great decisions in Australian industrial history. The directors of this brand new little company said, we'll go to the United States. We'll go to the best mines in the United States and we'll see if we can steal the best men. And so they sent one of their members to Colorado, looking around to see who was the best. And they brought back a famous mine manager from the Comstock Lode, from Virginia City, named Patton, and they brought back a younger man of German descent named Hermann Schlapp, and they became the technical expertise at Broken Hill. And I think one of the things you can say about the history of BHP, the long history of BHP, is that whenever there was a challenge or a crisis or a great technical problem, they always looked for expertise and were willing to pay for it. That was fairly unusual in our country at that time.
The perspectives of these newcomers created better ways of working and greater efficiencies. As the mine at Broken Hill deepened, the silver lead decreased and massive quantities of zinc appeared. Unable to extract the zinc by the traditional gravity process, BHP's general manager, Guillaume Delpois, and others working at the mine developed a froth flotation system.
It's a very simple idea. You know how if you look at a glass of champagne, you see the bubbles continually rising. Well, here was these huge vats of, call it champagne if you like, with minerals sitting on the surface of the bubbles and going to the surface, and the non-minerals staying at the bottom. It really is an ingenious invention. All around the world, you can go now to Siberia, or South America, or South Africa, you'll see versions of this flotation process in operation. It's one of the great inventions in the history of metallurgy, and it was largely invented at Broken Hill, and BHP was one of the front runners in the many, many inventions which were necessary before you perfected this strange process. And this was a way of saving the zinc, and suddenly Broken Hill became a large zinc producer as well as producer of silver and lead. So that Broken Hill became, if you like, a kind of laboratory where everyone was doing experiments. BHP, the biggest company, of course. Finding an ore body is very important, finding a rich deposit. That's wonderful, but a lot of rich deposits haven't made much money because they haven't been worked very efficiently. I think it's fair to say that right from the start, BHP worked its mine efficiently.
A great number of the company's early innovations came from employees at the mine site. It was their insight and ingenuity that identified better ways of working and formed the foundation of BHP Billiton's culture of empowering people to make observations, step up, and find better ways of doing things. The mine at Broken Hill came to be considered one of the great ore deposits of the world because of its size, richness, and continuity. But by 1912, as the company's silver, lead, and zinc activities became less profitable, the leaders of BHP started questioning what else they could do. By now, they mined iron ore to use in the smelting process, and they thought, why don't we make steel? BHP again recognised the need to source the best knowledge in the world, and Guillaume Delpois enlisted the help of American steelworks manager and innovator David Baker to advise on establishing steelmaking in Australia. Baker suggested the company ship iron ore from South Australia to a town called Newcastle, approximately 160 kilometres north of Sydney, where coal was abundant. 3 years later, operations in the Newcastle steelworks commenced. Steel was the essence of industrialisation, and the progress that the new steelworks represented was seen as a great milestone in Australia's history.
It's regarded as one of the red-letter days in the economic history of our land. In the 20th century, steel was really the essence of industrialisation. You weren't a modern country unless you had an efficient steel industry. And all over Australia, people rejoiced that at last we had these great steelworks in Newcastle.
It was an industry that would define BHP for decades to come. One contract in particular stands out, supplying some of the steel for the structure and iconic arch of the Sydney Harbour Bridge. While Australia embraced its surging industrialisation, the Depression and World War II would change the country's economic landscape. BHP's leadership and capacity for innovation quickly saw the company positioned front and centre of Australia's efforts during these difficult times. In 1921, Australian-born Essington Lewis, who had risen from mining engineer to steelmaker to mine manager, then became general manager of BHP. Lewis was known for his incredible work ethic. "I am work" was his mantra. He embarked on many fact-finding missions around the world, always looking for ways BHP could capitalise on the opportunities of a rapidly changing business environment.
He used to buy very good suits, but he filled his pockets with so many notebooks that the suits in no time looked rather ragged. It was really a sign to the employees he met, especially to the heads of industrial plants, that they really had to know everything, because if they didn't, he would tell them what was happening in their own business. A very old-fashioned way of doing work, but I think people respected him.
Well ahead of his contemporaries, and with a keen analytical mind, Lewis returned from a trip to Japan convinced the country was preparing for war, posing a threat to Australia.
He went to Japan in 1934, and to his astonishment, he had an appointment to go to the steelworks. Here's Japan arming itself, and we may ultimately be one of the targets.
In 1936, the Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation was established. Initiated by Lewis, it brings together BHP, the Orient Steam Navigation Company, General Motors Holden, and 3 other organisations. The corporation produced the first military aircraft in Australia, known as the Wirraway, and demonstrated the willingness of BHP to rise to a challenge.
Of course, the Wirraway was no match for the fastest Japanese planes. They didn't realise. They said, we can do better. So this is really a considerable achievement for Australia. It's unusual that a country should mass produce military aircraft before it could mass produce the ordinary motor car. But so much of the industrialisation of Australia that came in the late 1940s and the 1950s and 1960s was based on all the skills learned and the techniques developed during the Second World War. So Lewis is really a very important figure.
With Australia now building aircraft, Lewis couldn't understand why the country was still importing ships from overseas. Once steel technology became available, BHP started to build ships at Whyalla in South Australia, near the iron ore mine they had purchased. The corvette warship, HMAS Whyalla, was launched on the 12th of May, 1941.
That was part of his belief that Australians, if they set to it, could do anything, and that Australia could become an industrialised country, just as Belgium and Germany and Italy and Britain had become industrialised countries.
Like BHP, Billiton too realised the importance of looking further afield to diversify. While Billiton was a very successful tin miner, the company realised tin was a finite resource. Prior to the start of World War II, Billiton expanded its operations, establishing their first bauxite mine, the raw material processed to produce aluminium, on Bintan Island in Indonesia in 1935. 4 years later, the company started exploring for bauxite in Suriname, South America. Operations commenced there in 1941, and the mine became an important contributor to manufacturing wartime equipment. The war years deeply affected Billiton's operations. When the Japanese invaded the Dutch East Indies, they assumed control of the mine on Bintan Island, and the Germans took over Billiton's head office in Holland. Although Billiton lost its mines in Indonesia, they were able to retain their tin smelter in Holland, as well as mines in South America and Dutch Guyana. With the war over, BHP's iron ore, coal and steel were underpinning the rapid development of modern infrastructure, bridges, buildings and railways. Likewise, Billiton's minerals and aluminium were building the cars and consumer goods that industrialised economies needed as national incomes rose. As demand for modern communications, machines and energy grew, both companies asked once again, what's next? What opportunities could be unlocked with exploration into new countries, new commodities? In the 1960s, Australia had no oil, a huge disadvantage in the age of cars, trucks and aircraft. In 1963, BHP was searching for opportunities outside steel and coal and turned to oil and natural gas. Realising the need to identify best practice, BHP enlisted the help of American petroleum geologist Dr. Lewis Weeks, who suggested exploring Bass Strait. BHP joined forces with Esso to drill in the narrow sea between Victoria and Tasmania. Natural gas was discovered in 1965 and oil in 1967. It was the first major oil discovery in Australia.
It was one of the big moments in Australian history. The dream of having a large payable oil field, suddenly it was true, and BHP had found it. Came just at the right time. The world had its worst oil crisis in its history in 1973. They call it the OPEC crisis. And oil became very expensive. In some European countries it was rationed. People had to queue to buy oil, and here was Australia virtually self-sufficient in oil from Bass Strait. In the early 1970s, we prospered. We did very well with our own oil at a time when oil was so exorbitant in other countries. My own view is that the discovery of oil in Bass Strait did more for the standard of living in Australia in the following 10 years than the sum total of all the legislation passed by the Australian federal and state parliaments.
Also in the 1960s, the Pilbara in northwestern Australia was opening up. BHP realised there was an opportunity to become a significant iron ore exporter instead of consuming virtually all of its own iron ore resources. The mining town of Newman was established in the 1960s, and in 1969, the first shipments of iron ore left Newman, travelling 426 kilometres by rail to Port Hedland.
Welcome to my office. It's about 2.5 billion years old, it's about 6 k's long and 1.75 k's wide. I'm standing here right at the very bottom of the place at the moment, and we're about 240 metres below the natural ground surface. By the time this mine's finished, this surface will have gone down yet another 120 metres below where I'm standing.
BHP's ability to adapt to the needs of a rapidly changing world was paying off. However, its capacity for transformation had only just begun.
You might reckon that the great American prairie land is a funny place for an Australian company to be looking for oil. It's 100 degrees in the shade in the summer and 20 below in the winter.
Known throughout the country as the Big Australian, globally, BHP's interests were very small. This would change forever in one decisive action.
The board supports Brian Loughton's implementation of a coordinated global program to achieve increased profits in BHP's 3 core businesses: mining, steel, and petroleum.
With the acquisition of Utah International from General Electric in 1984, BHP became a major global minerals company. The purchase extended BHP's operations into the United States, Brazil, Canada, and Chile. And with the addition of operations in Queensland's Bowen Basin, it became one of the world's major coal exporters. The acquisition of Utah International included the Escondida copper prospect, discovered in 1981, which BHP developed into the Escondida mine that was commissioned in 1990. Escondida ultimately became the largest copper mine in the world. Then in 1985, BHP acquired the US Energy Reserves Group and Monsanto's oil and gas interests. The move strengthened BHP's presence in the United States, which is today home to the head office of the company's global petroleum business in Houston, Texas. For BHP, it was an exciting time of acquisitions and growth into new areas. The period was also one of rapid change for Billiton. By 1970, the directors of Billiton decided to accept a takeover offer from another Dutch firm, Royal Dutch Shell. At that time, the Billiton company was smaller and less diverse than BHP, but global in its scope. In 1994, South African company Gencor was looking to expand and bought most of Billiton's mineral assets, including ventures in gold, nickel, copper and zinc. By 1997, the directors of Gencor had agreed to a massive reorganisation. They bundled together the company's assets and floated them on the London Stock Exchange. Needing a name for the company, they decided on Billiton due to its reputation and history, and so the company came to life again as Billiton plc. By the end of the century, both BHP and Billiton had emerged as major players on the world stage. Billiton was no longer at Billiton Island and BHP no longer at Broken Hill, and both would soon realise the rich opportunities of becoming one company. BHP and Billiton merged on the 29th of June 2001, forming one of the world's largest diversified resources companies.
Assets that were brought in by Billiton were strongest in the aluminium industry, in the mining of bauxite, the refining of alumina, and in the smelting of aluminium, but of course it had a great variety of other assets. BHP's big assets that came into the merger were the huge iron ore business in the Pilbara, the great coal export trade in the Bowen Basin, the huge copper deposit being developed in Chile, and of course a variety of other adventures, not least oil, BHP by then being interested in oil in many parts of the world. So these two very different companies came together in 2001 under a common name, listed on the London and the Australian stock exchanges. The Australian government, of course, had to give approval to the merger, and it was very eager that the head office of this new giant mining company should be in Australia. And so the head office remained in Melbourne, and this company with assets all over the world set to work to make one where previously there were two.
Acquisitions throughout the 2000s continued to strengthen BHP Billiton's portfolio. In 2005, the acquisition of WMC Resources, which included the Olympic Dam ore body, meant BHP Billiton became the world's second largest copper producer and the third largest nickel producer. And in 2011, BHP Billiton further expanded its horizons with an entry into the United States shale business by acquiring Fayetteville Shale, followed by Petrohawk Energy's natural gas and liquid-rich shale asset. The last decade has marked another extraordinary chapter in the history of BHP Billiton. It is a chapter characterised by a united vision and strategy for the future, and one that saw BHP Billiton perfectly positioned to capitalise on unprecedented commodity growth in the early 21st century.
For more than a decade, our strategy has remained the same: to own and operate large, long-life, low-cost, expandable, upstream assets, diversified by commodity, geography and market. This strategy has underpinned the most recent milestone in BHP Billiton's history, the demerger of assets to form a new organisation, South32, in 2015. This decision simplified the BHP Billiton portfolio in one significant step and enabled the company to focus on a four-pillar strategy of coal, iron ore, copper and petroleum, with a potential fifth pillar in potash.
Throughout BHP Billiton's rich history, it is our people who have driven us to realise our potential. People who are as diverse as the communities and cultures they represent. And what unites us are our values, set out in our guiding principles, the BHP Billiton Charter.
It's the way we do business today, it's how we're going to do business in the future, and the way in which we're going to get there.
It's about walking the talk, from the shop floor to our customers to our supplier.
I think the charter values are really important and really ground us as an organisation in terms of what we expect of ourselves and of one another.
So I think the charter is a mechanism that does bind the thinking and behaviour of all employees in the organisation.
We've empowered people to focus in and hone in on what matters the most to drive success.
Our company makes clear its dedication to its people through the first value of the BHP Billiton Charter, sustainability. Central to this core value is ensuring that the health, safety, and well-being of our people always comes first. BHP Billiton has long been recognized by the mining industry as a leader in protecting the health of our people, including a holistic focus on well-being. We aspire to a fatality-free work environment. Ensuring our people go home safe and healthy at the end of each day lies at the heart of our charter values.
Sustainability is our first charter value, and I think that says a lot about the company. We truly do put safety, health and environment before everything else.
The things that we do at work do impact on our families and our kids.
We actually place such a high value on the health and safety of our employees at all times. You can really have great outcomes in health and safety and continue to drive productivity and simplicity at the same time.
Consistent with our charter values, we believe environmental responsibility has two components. Firstly, to understand and minimize our impacts, and secondly, to contribute more broadly as environmental stewards. BHP Billiton was one of the first mining companies to prohibit exploration or mining in World Heritage areas, and the first to prohibit the disposal of tailings into riverine or marine environments. We continue to look for ways to drive energy efficiency, develop and deploy low-emission technology, and adapt to the impacts of climate change.
It automatically registered with me. I just thought that this is something that I can get a genuine value add in terms of contributing to the science and contributing to the environment, and it's all in alignment with what BHP Billiton stand for.
This project and partnership represents an innovative approach where private companies play a key role in addressing the challenges of biodiversity conservation.
You know, it's a great feeling to be involved with a company that seriously cares about the environment.
Being part of this partnership makes you feel really proud. It's an enormous contribution to the conservation efforts in Chile.
Our charter value of sustainability also underpins our approach to communities. From the earliest possible stage of a project's life, BHP Billiton engages with local communities to understand local needs, resources, and to build strong relationships for the long term. Since 2001, BHP Billiton has committed to investing 1% of pre-tax profits in communities in the areas of economic development, education and training, health and environment programs, Indigenous community support, and disaster relief.
Making a contribution here, it's something that I really enjoy. It brings the sense of purpose that we talk about in our values.
It's also recognising that the people who work in the organisation is committed to the work that we do in our community and Indigenous affairs space.
It's really important that we consider sustainability in everything that we do so that we can help drive lasting benefits for the communities in which we operate.
For many years, we have been developing and contributing to industry, communities and economies across the globe. Today, we are recognised for our role in creating economic and social stability. Each year, tens of billions of dollars are contributed to local economies in the form of wages, taxes, royalties, and the purchase of goods and services. Perhaps the greatest contribution is the role our commodities play in economic growth and development, reducing poverty and improving living standards around the world. Access to commodities is crucial for construction materials, consumer goods, agriculture, and affordable energy. We are proud of the role we play in supporting global development.
No longer simply the big Australian, BHP Billiton has evolved over many decades as a global player with employees in every corner of the world. And those origins of looking beyond the surface, of innovation, of asking what's next, seeking the best of the best, remain at our core. This is who we are. This is our contribution to the world. This is BHP Billiton.